The game begins with pawn to e4, met by pawn to e5. In response to pawn to e4, I suggest opting for the bold pawn to d5, known as the Falkbeer Counter Gambit. In this position, white has several options, including capturing on e5, capturing on d5, playing knight to f3, playing knight to c3. We will go through all these variations. So stick around until the end, as it is quite tricky to play for both black and white. First of all, if white captures on e5, it is considered a beginner's mistake. Why? Because queen to h4 delivers a check, and white is forced to play pawn to g3. After pawn to g3, queen takes e4 wins the rook, giving black a decisive advantage. Alternatively, if white tries king to e2, black launches a decisive attack. Queen takes e4, king to f2, bishop to c5. Now, after king to g3, there is a checkmate in few moves. Let's return to the main position and examine the main line, pawn takes d5. This is, by far, the most sound variation for white to play. At this point, you can capture on f4 and adopt a very solid approach, minimizing counterplay opportunities for white. However, this line can be quite dull and complicated, as black ends up with 4 pawns on the king side, while white has 5 pawns on the queen side, making the position messy. Instead, we aim to play aggressively, in an attacking spirit. By advancing pawn to e4, gaining more space. By playing pawn to e4, we become the ones initiating the gambit rather than white. This move also restricts white's knight from developing to f3. White can respond with knight to c3 or pawn to d3, which are fairly similar. Against either move, we counter with knight to f6 to protect the pawn on e4. White is likely to play pawn to d3, challenging the center and attempting to capture on e4. At this point, you can pin white's knight and continue developing your pieces. You are now ready to castle and bring your rook to e8. After pinning the knight on c3, white has 2 main options. Playing bishop to d2, capturing on e4. Let's examine both scenarios. If white captures on e4, it might seem natural to castle immediately. However, this allows pawn to e5, giving white the initiative. To avoid this, take the pawn on e4 instead, attacking the knight. If white plays bishop to d2, you can then castle, preparing to bring your rook to e8 for a quick attack. On the other hand, if white takes on e4, black can lose a piece because the bishop on b4 becomes vulnerable. If you trade bishops on d2, white will recapture with the knight, resulting in a blundered piece for black. To avoid this, instead of castling immediately, capture white's bishop on d2 first. After white recaptures on d2, you can castle safely and position your rook on the e-file for an aggressive counterattack. This sets up a dynamic position with plenty of attacking opportunities. In this position, you can also play queen to h4 check, and if white responds with king to e2, you can continue with queen to e2 check. After king to d3, you can play bishop to f5, and white is soon getting checkmated. Returning to the main position, if white plays pawn to g3, you can respond with knight takes g3, taking advantage of the pin on the rook. If white captures the knight, black wins the rook. However, rather than taking the rook, you can instead focus on delivering a faster checkmate by capturing on g3. If white moves the king to e2, you can play bishop to g4 check, forcing the white king to f3. After bishop takes f3, while this move might still be winning, it does not result in a checkmate. Instead, after queen takes f3, it leads to a checkmate. If white moves king to e1, then queen to g3 is an immediate checkmate. Now, let's return to the main position. After pawn to d3, white often plays knight to c3, and black responds with knight to f6. When white continues with pawn to d3, black develops with bishop to b4, pinning the knight. White may then play bishop to d2, trying to break the pin from black's dark-squared bishop. In this position, capturing on d3 is not ideal because white can recapture with the bishop, equalizing the position and solving their problems. Instead, a strong novelty is to play pawn to e3, hitting the bishop and sacrificing a second pawn to maintain the initiative and launch an attack. If white captures on e3, black can recapture the pawn on d5 with the knight, attacking both the bishop and the knight on c3. White is then forced to retreat the bishop to d2, and black can castle, creating the threat of rook to e8 check. If white trades on d5, black plays rook to e8 check, and after white blocks with bishop to e2, black sacrifices the bishop on b4 and captures on d5. This aggressive sequence showcases the attacking potential of the Falkbeer Counter Gambit, which is a highly dynamic and sharp opening. The reason is that all of black's pieces are highly active in the center, aiming to attack. If white captures the bishop on b4, black will respond by taking on g2, winning the rook on h1. In this position, the best move for white is actually to move the king to d2, but this is an unnatural and illogical move. As it stands, white is losing. After the moves pawn to e4, pawn to d5, and white captures on d5, black plays pawn to e4. Let's examine the move bishop to b5, which delivers a check to the black king. Here, black has the option of blocking with bishop to d7, which is perfectly fine. However, a stronger and more ambitious option for black is to play pawn to c6. In this position, white is forced to capture on c6. And although knight to c6 is a reasonable recapture, black should take with the pawn to maintain the initiative. While this slightly damages black's pawn structure, white is wasting valuable time and remains extremely weak on the kingside. This gives black a significant advantage. After white plays bishop to c4, black can continue developing with knight to f6. If white responds with queen to e2, attempting to put pressure on the e4 pawn, black should continue with bishop to c5. After pawn to d3, aiming to capture on e4, black can simply castle. In case white captures on e4, remember this tactic: knight takes e4. After queen takes e4, rook to e8 pins the white queen to the king, and black wins the game immediately. Now, returning to the main position. If white does not play bishop to b5 check and instead goes for pawn to c4 to defend the d5 pawn, black should play pawn to c6, again sacrificing another pawn. After white captures, black can recapture with the knight. At this point, not only has white weakened their kingside by pushing the pawn to f4, leaving the dark squares weak, but also the queenside is now weakened by the move pawn to c4. This gives black a strong position. Why is black in a good shape here? If white continues with moves like knight to c3, black can continue with normal moves such as bishop to c5, maintaining the advantage. White will struggle to develop their pieces on the kingside. If white tries to develop knight to e2, it blocks the bishop's development. If white plays bishop to e2, then the knight becomes trapped and has no way to develop. White's only hope to keep the game alive is to play pawn to d4, sacrificing another pawn. To simplify development, after bishop takes d4, white can play knight to g2 with tempo, attacking the black bishop. In response, black should play bishop to g4, maintaining pressure. If white plays queen to c2 to escape the pin, black can continue developing with knight to e7. The reason we play knight to e7 instead of knight to f6 is that this knight will have a future on the d5 square, where it can exert pressure on d4. After knight takes d4, black recaptures with the knight on d4, attacking the white queen. If white responds with queen takes e4, black has a couple of good options. One option is to play bishop to f5, but it's often better to castle first. Castling allows the rook to become active on the e-file, and the white queen, centralized on e4, becomes a vulnerable target. White's best move here is bishop to d3, aiming for counterplay and potential checkmate threats. To neutralize these threats, black must block the diagonal. However, playing pawn to g6 would weaken the dark squares around the king, and pawn to f5 would weaken the light squared diagonal. Instead, the optimal move is bishop to f5, attacking the white queen and the bishop behind it. In response, white's best move is queen to e3, but black should avoid trading queens as this benefits white. Instead, black should continue developing while creating threats. The main idea is to play rook to e8, aiming to control the open file. Ideally, black can exchange on d3 and bring the knight to b4, creating powerful threats that white cannot defend against. With rook to e8 and this coordinated attack, white is in a losing position. Thanks for watching.